Thank you, Ingmar, and thanks to everyone for joining me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about this, and in particular, I wanted to thank Madalina Diaconu, who I've got to know personally very recently, and whose work has been very meaningful to the development of my own work as a studio and performance artist. And obviously she's worked in olfaction, but the work in the haptic arts and gustatory arts as it relates to aesthetics has offered me in many opportunities to reconsider my own work from a more philosophical standpoint. And that's really a part of the kind of working program I have as an artist. So as Ingmar mentioned, the talk is titled The Olfactory Present and the Future Museum. The destination will eventually be the museum. We'll eventually arrive there, but we're going to take a circuitous route, mostly because I'm driving and I have an idiosyncratic relationship to the landscape. I don't know how to get there any faster, and anyway, there's no point in rushing because the museum isn't going anywhere. It's an institution that moves very slowly. And if you're like me and love that about it, you appreciate that there's this tacit agreement to stay put. And it's even echoed in the institution's name, museum. To muse is to meditate, to slowly ponder, to allow yourself to be absorbed in thought. It can be seen as an antidote to our cultures of amusement. Amuse, which in its archaic form meant to divert one's attention so as to deceive. But this dichotomy isn't as pure as one might think. As we circle around this institution, we'll see it from some less than flattering perspectives. But my goal is to point out what a demarginalized, less hegemonic museum of the future might look like. So let me share my screen and begin my talk. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I come to philosophy from the practice of art making. By making art, I can make claims about the nature of knowledge and the means by which we understand the world. My practice is unconventional insofar as it privileges the event of experiencing art over the aura surrounding the object that is experienced. In fact, most of my work is objectless insofar as my artistic medium or media are smells, which are invisible to the naked eye. I compose, choreograph, and transmit odors in art museums. This talk reflects on an ongoing project that uses smell as the focal point for an aesthetic event designed to survey and activate an art museum's potential to facilitate civic dialogue. Interspersed throughout the talk will be didactic images like this, which will situate the subject matter of the talk in relation to a larger project that I'm developing on olfactory aesthetics. So the first tenet in this project is that thresholds of olfactory perception. We're going to talk a little bit about perceiving olfactory space and perceiving olfactory time. So, how would your understanding of your city differ if you let your nose rather than your eyes lead the way? So begins Sillage, an olfactory artwork I designed in 2011 and have since launched at 3 urban art museums. Every incarnation of Sillage centers on a collection of artist-made scents that represent the major regions of the city in which the partnering museum is based. My intent was to use neighborhood names that locals recognize as specific regions of the city, names that call to mind specific scent memories and associations. I design each collection of scents based on a survey that the museum launches, which asks the residents of the city to describe smells that they associate with familiar regions. The museum launches the survey as much as a year in advance of the project. This allows for several hundred residents to take the survey and gives me time to digest the data and compose scents informed by survey responses. Once I have a clear idea about what residents think their city smells like, I embark on scent walks in an effort to identify the smells described in the survey. These smells can be thought of as a scentscape, so like a landscape, a scentscape, which would be defined as a fragrance in which a distinctive background smell describing the sky and the ground creates a foundation on top of which episodic smells reveal themselves over time. Back in my studio and olfactory lab, which is where I'm coming to you guys from right now in San Diego, I use perfume-grade materials to simulate these neighborhood scentscapes. Here are a few examples that describe the scentscapes that were used in various incarnations of Sillage. So when Sillage was in Los Angeles, the smell of West Los Angeles, that neighborhood, which is home to Beverly Hills 90210, among other elite zip codes, is described as wet lawn gives way to dry air, which gives way to the clean sweat of a trophy wife. Whereas in South Los Angeles, that neighborhood is described as metallic heat and hydraulic fluid pulse over old asphalt. When I did this project at the Walters Museum in Baltimore, I'll give you two examples of those. Southeast Baltimore was described as sweet air filled with freshly baked bread and the feeling that it's going to rain. And in central Baltimore, which is its downtown, it was described as harbor air and rat must wade through traffic. So likely you'll notice two things. First, these descriptions are temporal. One smell leads to another smell and so on. This idea is going to be important in a minute. Second, you'll notice that these descriptions are notoriously stereotypical. I didn't write them as much as I aggregated the most common descriptions submitted to the surveys. What appears to be the uncritical peddling of olfactory stereotypes is actually a tactic on my part, a foil to spur people to action, to get them to come to the event at the museum and talk about what they're actually smelling. So the second tenet in the olfactory present, literal and figurative migration brings together a clash of olfactory rituals, byproducts, and traditions. The unself-conscious contempt with which people verbally describe the smell of the other points to a kind of intolerance that I suspect would be curtailed, at least or at least euphemized for the sake of decorum, if they were describing any other sensory phenomena. In addition to eliciting a subjective visceral reaction, smell originates in a part of the brain resistant to language. As such, most people find it difficult to verbally describe smells. At least that's what I'm banking on when, in the weeks leading up to the Sillage event, media begins promoting the project by provocatively describing the smells that will be unveiled. Sillage culminates in a one-day event in which patrons, upon entering the museum, identify the region in which they live to the museum staff, who then log the data and spray a corresponding scent on the patron's wrist. The only rule I give museum staff assisting with the project is that if patrons want to smell a neighborhood other than their own, they must approach other patrons and ask to smell them. The word sillage is taken from the French word for wake, as in the fleeting mark left in the water by a passing ship. This metaphor is commonly used in the perfume world to describe the fragrant trail that is left after the scented body has crossed one's path. In spite of Sillage taking place within the context of the museum, an institution with no shortage of social mores, there is surprisingly little reticence among patrons about approaching a stranger and asking for a sniff. In fact, the sensory wonder of consuming olfactory art and the intimate thrill of transgressing social and institutional norms seems to motivate even the least impetuous patrons to participate. And all of this against the backdrop of the museum, in which, as hundreds of documentary photos from Sillage projects will attest, the painting, sculpture, and other cultural objects on exhibit function essentially as decor. At least for a few short hours, Sillage activates the museum site as a platform for participation in public life by using neighborhood smells to initiate informal conversations with visitors around the topic of urbanism. Hannah Arendt might refer to this effect as the vita activa. Unlike many philosophers who would prefer the head, or at least the mind, be permanently detached from the body, Arendt championed the philosophy of public activity, being present, speaking, and listening, which is to say, remembering. Her metaphor of the polis was built on material culture, which extended even into the natural environment. In The Human Condition, she structures the text around the ascending hierarchy of labor, work, and action, which she considers to be three fundamental human activities. At the bottom of the hierarchy, labor is that which allows biological life to exist, those things which humans share with other animals. Work is designated by those artificial constructions that are grafted onto the natural. These are often the mundane things, such as cars, buildings, and roads that are made by humans and designed to outlive their makers. It is around these constructions that culture, the world, and its associated worldviews are structured. While labor is based on the individual and is therefore inherently private, work, both its material and metaphorical instantiations, is cultural and inherently public. For Arendt, to be active in the world, one must be in public, that literal and figurative sphere, not created by God or nature, but created by the work of people. The third tenet in the olfactory present, the sense of smell often shakes us awake to the differences in which we experience the present. So within this context, it's important for me to position Sillage in the domain of public art. In public art, the idea of collective memory is often considered when designing monuments and memorials. Throughout the world, the built environment is full of objects, such as this one, the Baltimore Washington Monument, that claim to embody a specific public's memory. However, as opposed to embodying collective memory, many such objects have been criticized for displacing it. Through their permanent material, masculine nature, and rigid meaning, conventional monuments have been challenged for being impotent, symbolic markers, unable to adapt to a public that's constantly in flux. With the olfactory public artwork, this is inverted. Counter monuments such as Sillage are highly ephemeral, physically unimposing, and capable of generating discourse chiefly because they provoke memory. Olfactory space is fundamentally temporal. We can smell because scent molecules known as odorants evaporate in the air, which gives the impression of an odor when inhaled. Not coincidentally, many of these odorants happen to be the olfactory byproducts of the very material culture, the cars, the buildings, the roads, that for Arendt constituted the world of humans. Most odors are made up of dozens of different sized scent molecules. Depending on the size of the molecule, evaporation takes place quickly or slowly, which is to say, the intensity of some odors diminish within seconds or minutes, while others last hours, even days. So for instance, in this slide, you see kind of how perfumers would notate this phenomenon, and they're using a musical metaphor where typically the first things that you smell in a scent would be the smaller notes, the smaller molecules, the notes that would evaporate very quickly within a matter of minutes or seconds. Then come slightly heavier molecules that last several minutes. And then the kind of molecules that stick around for days oftentimes are referred to as base notes. They're the heaviest, largest molecules. Now, it's also why some dimensions of an odor are more or less pronounced at different phases of evaporation. For me, composing odors for an art experience is therefore a temporal and spatial proposition. Left to their own devices, odors do not respect boundaries, which makes them spatially hostile. Yet due to their invisibility, they can have arresting perceptual effects that, in my opinion, compare in visceral terms to experiencing the physical and material qualities of a sculpture. However, as opposed to a conventional sculpture or monument that taunts time with its seemingly permanent materials only to sooner or later succumb to it, the ephemeral nature of the olfactory counter-monument mediates the experience of time by continually reminding participants that smell will soon be, at best, a memory. The sense of smell is atmospheric. Considered alone, it produces feelings, mood, and affect, but not many thoughts due to its distance from language, metaphorical, and conceptual processes. Let me now talk a little bit about the dialogical paradox of olfactory art. If temporality is at the core of the let me begin again. If temporality is at the core of the olfactory counter-monument, then there is an implied dialectical responsibility on the part of participants to resist forgetting. But forgetting what? What they smelled? Not entirely. In the case of Sillage, the what is related to the idea that the smells of the city were disembodied from the urban and suburban worlds that produced them and then relocated to the museum, a site normally distinguished by its antiseptic attitude toward odors. The olfactory byproducts of tourism, industry, transportation, gentrification, and a host of other factors arrested patrons at every turn, offering idealized, if incomplete, experiences that needed to be talked into completeness. In his unique contribution to the phenomenology of olfactory environments, a text called Magic Perfume Dream, Alfred Gell argues that smell is an ideal that, quote, hovers on the edge of actualization, unquote, in a way that is completed by the experience of the smell and the context that created it. In Sillage, the city smells were divorced from their origins. However, the sense I designed for each incarnation of Sillage were completely crowdsourced by residents of the city, which suggests that participants would, at one time or another, have experienced most of the smells in the context that created them. So, part of the challenge for patrons in solving the phenomenological puzzle had to do with talking about where they were and how they felt when they experienced those scents. So where they were, involving remembering, and how they felt, involving emotions. Here's where we arrive at what I call the dialogical paradox of the olfactory counter-monument. As previously mentioned, not only are most people unable to identify common smells by name, they also have a difficult time even describing what they smell. To be fair, most languages have very few, if any, words that are used specifically to describe smell. The reason for this, scholars speculate, is that smell is not processed linguistically. Smell bypasses the thalamus and goes straight to the limbic system, where it's processed in the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is directly connected to the hippocampus and amygdala, two areas of the brain responsible for memory and emotion, respectively. This neural processing route distinguishes smell from taste, touch, and sight and sound. It also suggests why smell may elicit deeper memories and stronger emotions than the other senses. The fifth tenet in olfactory present. When considered alongside other sensory stimuli, smell allows us to parse the current contemporary from the historic contemporaries and locate the coming together, literally the with time in the contemporary present. So, whereas smell poses a challenge to linguistic scent making, it also stimulates a type of collective wonder that leads to active dialogue. Hence the dialogical paradox. But the direction a dialogue takes can be highly unpredictable. One reason is that people experience smells subjectively. For example, I'll go to this slide, the scent of West Baltimore, a dusty, musty, watery smell, is described as decaying air of demolished building washes down sidewalk. The involuntary reaction to that scent might elicit hope in some residents who relate it to urban renewal, while it might evoke rage in others who equate it with gentrification of low-income neighborhoods. And yet others, it may trigger the nostalgia of a first kiss in a ghetto alleyway, while for others still, it may simply be an inconvenient stench that penetrated the air conditioning of their luxury automobile as it glided through the very same ghetto. The wide divergence of reactions to smell astonishes most participants who, in the safe confines of the museum, can reflect upon and discuss these olfactory triggers. One upshot of this astonishment is to carry on sustained conversation with others in a way that does not prioritize or invalidate the subjective experience. Rather, it is through the plurality of narratives that the spatial and temporal experiences brought about through dialogue actualize these sense. Going back to the Alfred Gell quote. Ultimately, it's the memory of these dialogues that should be preserved. Due to the volatility of smell, it must be reenacted, reperformed, and redistributed to maintain presence. Engaging in the dialogical paradox activates an art audience and changes its role from spectator to participant. In The Human Condition, Arendt noted that to be political, to exist in a polis required speech or rhetoric rather than force or violence. A champion of plurality, she theorized a public domain that was built on, quote, the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives, unquote. This domain, or what she called space of appearance, was intended to endure by being enacted and reenacted by subsequent generations. For Arendt, actions cannot take place in isolation. Public acts depended on the plurality of perspectives and identities of the citizenry, each containing the a priori potential to invoke novel and unexpected contributions. By being witnessed in public, one's contribution could be evaluated and remembered. Arendt's metaphor of the polis was based on the ancient Greeks, who had a very exclusive understanding of what it meant to be a free man. I don't fault her for using the metaphor, especially since she was reaching back to the ancients for an antidote to what she called the loss of the world, that she viewed as a byproduct of modernity. But not all features of that metaphor translate and scale to accommodate the multicultural plurality of the global present. Accelerated globalization is interconnected, once disparate cultures, creating constellations of temporalities and modes of experiencing time. This makes for a fundamentally more ruptured public domain than could be conjured by that phrase, the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives. Olfactory space and olfactory time distinguish itself from spatial and temporal compression of the internet and other networked social and informational technologies. In their essay, The Contemporary Condition, Introductory Thoughts on Contemporaneity and Contemporary Art, Jeff Cox and Jacob Lund persuasively argue that our present is characterized by a multitude of different temporalities on different scales, which run parallel, but often interconnect. They distinguish a colloquial definition of the contemporary, the now, whatever that happens to be, from a critical definition of the temporary. While the former category periodizes the present era, the latter exemplifies an experiential way of registering coexisting temporalities, however unevenly distributed and subjectively experienced they might be. Cox and Lund noted, quote, put simply, our relation to time is constituted or mediated by the technical means through which it is apprehended, end of quote. No doubt, in this era of the global present, particularly in cities throughout the world, do we apprehend time differently? And yet most of us often overlook the potential of smell to activate the present, to apprehend the present. Smells spatialize and temporalize our environments. With every breath, we're offered updated olfactory data, and we breathe some 23 or 24,000 times a day. It may be a phenomenological truism to state that the senses mediate our perception of the world, but it's worth pointing out that smell could be that at least, let me say that again. It's a phenomenological truism to state that the senses mediate our perception of the world, but it's worth pointing out that smell could be the least mediated sense insofar as by ingesting air molecules, we're directly interfacing with the environment. This feature of smell can shake us awake to the real-time differences or chasms in olfactory time in which others experience the present. The attempt to make connections between chasms in olfactory time is an often overlooked aspect of Sillage, which, as a dialogical art form, prompts public conversation, but does not provide stable footing as to where one should begin talking. Topically, conversations often oscillate between the personal, the cultural, the political, the economic, and the technological registers. These topics begin and end, transform and overlap in no set order. Conversations tend to be experiential rather than technical or theoretical. They tend to be story-based, putting the narrator at the dynamic position of the experiencing subject. As rhetorical connections are developed, interconnections are made between chasms in olfactory time. It all begins with a slowing down and hopefully a sinking of time, a pause to consider, what is it exactly that I and you smell? And the final tenet in this olfactory present idea is this, that our experience of time and space become more aligned to network time, it's important for olfactory art to create temporal experiences that frustrate the hegemony of network time. So, by proposing a relational aesthetics situated around active smelling, talking, and listening, Sillage doesn't so much resist Immanuel Kant's formalist aesthetics as it sidesteps them. Kant's assertion that scent is not a vehicle for serious art holds little interest for me. There's already more than enough compelling evidence by philosophers such as Madalena Diacono and Larry Scheiner exposing his bias against smell, which, when coupled with current commercial, academic, and technological interests in olfaction, makes for a persuasive case that the sense of smell is alive and well. However, the lingering hierarchy of the senses is a rather benign reminder of an Enlightenment hubris that has institutionalized racism and promoted cultural superiority. And for that reason, I'm profoundly interested in the impact Kant's ideas have had on the shaping of museum culture. And I've devoted my practice to proposing alternatives to resist this hegemony. Kant's presence has long eclipsed the domains of aesthetics, penetrating the literal and figurative structure of the institutions that facilitate, contextualize, and disseminate art. The fact that it's only marginally more difficult to imagine a world before art museums than it is to imagine a world before art suggests how deeply pervasive Enlightenment thinking is to our own worldview. In order to arrive at a definition of a future museum that I argue resists the hegemonic legacies that have existed since the time of Kant, it's necessary to briefly trace the trajectory of the art museum from the Enlightenment through the post-war modern era into our own current era characterized by neoliberal agendas. Excuse me. The Kantian ideal arose at roughly the same time as the formation of art museums as we know them today. It helped shape the 19th century museum as an aristocratic space for nation states to educate and inspire its citizens. Those museums were often housed in neoclassical buildings designed to exemplify the kind of high seriousness that inspired self-abnegation for the glory and superiority of the nation state. Exhibitions featured treasured artwork culled from encyclopedic collections and systematically arranged to evoke narratives of national superiority. However, the brutality of the Second World War laid to rest any optimism that a peaceful society of nations could coexist. Moving forward into the Cold War, capitalist, liberal democracy, and socialism became competing claims that attempted to protect global human values. As director of the Museum of Modern Art, Alfred H. Bard Jr. offered new cultural perspective beyond nationalism. He linked social realism and totalitarianism championed by a bohemian avant-garde producing modern, or what he called abstract art. And I love diagrams like this just because it's so blatantly obvious that he's creating this narrative that winds up with the present being the United States offering a solution to the challenges that were, apparent for the previous, 100 years. Modern art soon became international in scope and was used as an ideological weapon of freedom against socialism, as argued in the great Art Forum article from 1974 by Eva Cockcroft, known as Abstract Expressionism, Weapon of the Cold War. By co-opting a version of Kantian aesthetics for modernist theory, critics such as Clement Greenberg championed a model of modern art that offered an autonomous, seemingly depoliticized viewing experience. While the white cube model of modern art spread throughout the Western world, audience could go to their regional museum and experience the linear progression of Western art history as naturally as they could walk from one gallery to the next. The late 1980s brought the fall of the Berlin Wall, and with it the cultural narrative that communism too had fallen. The effect this had on museum culture was multi-tiered. Free market values seeped into museum administration, I should say, at a time when culture wars and austerity measures threatened the status quo. Privatization, or the transferring of public funding from the arts to private sources, forced the museum to revise its mission from being collection-driven to being audience-driven. Marketing and demographics encouraged blockbuster exhibitions, like this one by the fashion designer Steve McQueen, which mixed spectacle and infotainment to draw crowds and revenue for museums, which were now expected to compete with cinema and concerts for the entertainment dollar. Museums became brands, commissioning blue-chip architects to design flagship campuses. The most elite even franchised their brands around the world. Yet at auction, many of these museums found themselves competing with members of their own boards of trustees, often unsuccessfully, for the so-called best work on the market. Some of these same trustees, as we see here, Eli Broad, a member or a former member of the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles Board of Directors, who in a tiff with the museum essentially left the board and bought a lot of real estate literally right across the street from the museum in order to put up his own private collection museum, which is especially perverse because some of these same trustees, like Broad and Marciano in the United States, had begun opening their own private museums, perversely receiving tax breaks from the United States government for doing so. So, culturally speaking, we're far from the Enlightenment quest for inquiry. Yet, as museums populate the globe, they bring with them vestiges of the Kantian paradigm. Auratic objects, usually static and visual, exist for our consideration in buildings that produce architecturally determined behaviors that, at best, limit what art's capable of doing. And yet, simultaneous to this, there exist so many modes of art making that work against social and political hegemony. Relational art, social specific art, activist art, research-based and archive-based practices, radical experiments in education as art, and of course, sensory-based art, such as olfactory art, sound art, haptic art, gustatory art, which is to say, projects that challenge the primacy of the visual. These modes of art making have become so pervasive that most have found their way into 21st century university art curriculum, training the next generation of counter-hegemonic thinkers and makers. I'm confident that the futures of art practice will be increasingly demarginalized, but what relationship will they have to the future museum? Working against the pervasiveness of this hegemony should be the chief concern of the future museum. Now, by future museum, I don't mean necessarily museums of contemporary art. I mean museums which, regardless of the holdings in their collection, aspire to deal with a critical contemporaneity through their mission and programming. One among many reference points for this topic is Claire Bishop's 2013 book-length essay, Radical Museology. Therein she asks, can a museum be anti-hegemonic? She answers in the affirmative, introducing her concept of dialectical contemporaneity as exemplified through the practice of three museums. I believe only one of which was a contemporary art museum. She argues that these museums define themselves against neoliberal interests that have, quote, creatively and intellectually crippled many of today's museums, which use blockbuster exhibitions to pander to mass audiences, corporate investors, and influential donors, end of quote. These museums create multi-temporal remapping of history and artistic production outside of national and disciplinary frameworks, rather than opting for a global inclusivity that pulls everything into the same narrative. An apt term to describe the result of these activities is the constellation, a word used by Walter Benjamin to describe a Marxist project of bringing events together in new ways, disrupting established taxonomies, disciplines, mediums, and properties. Rather than thinking of the museums as a storehouse of treasures, it can be reimagined as an archive of the commons. So when I conceived of Sillage, I imagined the museum playing the role of Arendt's metaphorical polis, this space of appearance where people could come together to form communities of memory, to make their appearance explicit. I knew that the museum's change in role would not come with a change in costume, that its core values, as exemplified by everything from its policies to its architecture to its personnel, would remain the same. But I welcomed that. The figure-ground relationship that distinguished what the museum temporarily became from what it previously had been, and no doubt would resume being after Sillage concluded, challenged patrons and museum staff to expand their imaginations by taking in the relevant cues, reflecting on them, and wondering about how this museum experience differed from previous ones. In so doing, the project resisted the forces of hegemony by using, of all things, air. Thank you.